I am actually really proud of the fact that I'm from Banff, and I'll tell you a bit more about my dad later on, but his first highway was a highway that went from Banff to Lake Louise. You may have heard of that one. He was a very proud engineer. And when I tell people I'm born in Banff, you almost never hear anybody who's born in Banff. If you could tell the truth, you discover that there were tens of thousands of children conceived in Banff, but almost none of them actually born here. When I heard we were here at the Banff Center, I was a bit concerned. I have friends who've been out here, and it's wonderful and world famous for his work on fine and performing arts and all the wonderful things that it does here. And I thought that Kevin was going to want me to do something really interesting, like transform this into an exercise in interpretive dance. Then I sort of looked in the mirror and thought, that would be really cruel to all of you if I tried something like this. I'm really delighted to be back here with you. I'm a real fan of education. I've written an awful lot on the transition from high school to college, university, and polytechs. I'm extremely worried about the future we're presenting to our children. We still, as a country and as a sort of a North American society, are doing a wonderful job of thinking about our children. It's particularly a problem for parents, of thinking about their children in terms of what it was like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I always say, I love universities, I've been there a long time. I say universities are really, really good at doing exactly what they should have done 15 years ago. And they're not very good at doing what they have to do for 15 years down the line. So when you hear through here, I hope you'll hear a lot of words of celebration of rural communities and of Western Canada. But there's an undercurrent, I think, of real concern. The world is changing so fast. You're doing a little bit of that here in Alberta right now. The world is changing so fast that we actually have to be much more nimble, and we have to prepare our young people for a world that we don't understand, and that actually, to be honest, we can't even imagine at this point. And the changes and transitions that we thought would take 50, 60, 70, 80 years will actually be happening in 5 or 10 years. And that makes it really hard on the school system. The expectations are sort of unrealistic in terms of how fast you'll change and how much you'll change and how much you'll do for young people as you go along. So my talk was called The Rural Advantage, Celebrating the Benefits of Growing Up Rural. And this is a topic that I've been working on for a long time. And it's come out of sort of more, I'm not sure if anger is the right word, but perhaps it'll do for now. The neglect of rural Canada in this country is absolutely profound. The limited amount of attention that it gets from politicians, from the media, from Canadians at large is really, really quite something. Rural Canada is the backbone, the front lines of Canada's future in a whole bunch of ways that I'll describe. I hope to convince you of that, although I suspect you already know it. And I really believe that there's an advantage growing up rural that we don't pay much attention to. That in fact is not just a place you're raised, it's a place that gives young people particular skills. And we can figure out how to enhance them and how to talk about them in some interesting ways. So the challenging times the minister referred to are fairly obvious. The challenges to the resource economy are real. I remember 4 years ago, everybody was talking about the endless boom, the fact that we were going to having energy-driven booms that were going to go on forever and ever and ever, and that Ontario was going to sort of be tipped out and 90% of the people would slide down to Alberta and sort of do all our work for us. So we just collected the money. It's a pretty good idea, actually. But the resource economy's changed, and it's changed really fast. And it must be a bit scary to be here in Alberta. We have a similar problem in Saskatchewan for obvious reasons. We share an awful lot in common. We also have, and this is not a partisan talk, we also have new governments. You have a new government in Alberta, and we have a new federal government. New governments come in, they change things. Governments want to do something new. They want to disassociate themselves from the governments of the past. They often have, in the case of Alberta, some 44 years of stored up ideas that they haven't had a chance to exercise. In the case of the federal government, 10 years of things they've wanted to do, and they want to do them all in the first 6 months or the first year or at least the first term. And you have to educate new political leaders. Governments change their administrative staff. New priorities take over from old priorities, and you have to guess where it's all going on the federal level and on the provincial level. We also have to face, and I'll talk about this a bit more as we go along, the rising power of the cities. Canada has become an aggressively urban country. It has been for a long time. It's like Australia. Australia has 80% of its population living in the largest 6 cities. Canada's getting pretty close to that, and is actually moving in that direction. If you take the area that stretches from Montreal to Ottawa, down to Toronto, to Hamilton, and actually some people include Buffalo, New York in this, you have an area that is, by itself, as a country, would be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So the power is sort of aggregating toward the cities in major ways, and we'll come back to that. The question is, how do you position your schools and your children for the 21st century? We're actually 16 years in, but it's going to change even more in the next coming decade as we sort of move forward. And the second part of this is, what is the role that schools should play in promoting rural Canada? You're not just in rural Canada. I would argue that the school system is perhaps the single most important institution in defining the future of rural Canada. And it's a role that you have whether you want it or not. You might think it belongs to your mayors and city councils. You might think it belongs to the provincial governments and the federal government. It doesn't. The question of the future of rural Canada actually rests in how you educate young people, how you train them to sort of meet the demands of rural Canada, and how you convince them to come home if, in fact, you are able to do that. So I approach this a little bit from the fact that I'm not an urban person. Universities in Canada are almost all built in big cities. The big research universities are all built in big cities. My personal preference is for small towns. I lived in Brandon, not a big city, but I actually lived outside in the country by preference. Lived in Squamish in British Columbia, not in Vancouver, so I can sort of be close to the big city, but not in it. And I was raised in Whitehorse, but just a couple of quick family stories to situate myself and to sort of see the very different approaches between my family and my wife's family. My father-in-law was born in Melfort, Saskatchewan, and his father was a World War I vet, and we just discovered a couple of years ago that he'd been actually hit on the head with a big construction beam that was used for one of the tunnels. They used to dig tunnels underneath the German lines and then fill a whole bunch of bombs there and then blow them up. Well, he was actually hit in the head with a beam, and it actually basically gave him epileptic fits for the rest of his life, although the family didn't know about it until we discovered the material in the archives. And so he had a real struggle. His family was poor. His wife basically held the family together in a way that's not unfamiliar in rural society. The wife sort of took in boarders. She did cooking. The RCMP people used to always stay in her house, and I'm sure if you go back into the 1930s and 40s, you'll find many people in your communities who did much the same thing. My father-in-law was cursed with asthma, and it was an asthma that he had that was affected by two things. One was hot weather and one was cold weather. And in Saskatchewan, that pretty much describes about 350 days of the year. He hated it. He hated it with a passion, or at least he thought he did. And the day after he graduated from high school, he was on the back of somebody's motorcycle and went from Melfort, Saskatchewan to Toronto, vowing that he would absolutely never return. And I was actually in his house, in his basement, and I got my job offer from Saskatchewan, faxed to me. And so I'm sitting here saying, I just got a job offer as the Dean of Arts and Science at Saskatchewan. And he said, I devoted my entire life to making sure my family never had to go back to that wretched place. But the part of this that's interesting, this is the bad part. That's the sort of, he lived in Vancouver. What do you expect from Vancouverites, right? He lived in Vancouver. And what was interesting is once we got the job there, he came back with us. And he reconnected with his high school friends from Melfort. And he actually rediscovered himself. He rediscovered his family. And he rediscovered community. And from that point on, right until the end of his life, he was going back regularly. He had friends from there would come and visit him in Vancouver. He would come back up on a regular basis. And he really came to understand what small-town life was really like and how much better it was than what he had in Vancouver. My mother actually was raised in Irricana, which is just outside of Calgary. It's now a suburb. You actually have like strip housing and all that kind of stuff out there, which made it look really, really odd. My father was raised in the interior of British Columbia. And his dad died when my dad was 10. And my dad was raised by a single mom at a time when that wasn't a very common sort of thing. And they basically had no money at all. He was raised in turn, his male role models were his uncles, who were big game guides and trappers. And so my father grew up in the Edgewood area, near Nakusp, near Nelson, grew up sort of on the land his entire youth. And he developed incredible skills as a problem solver. My father could fix anything, anytime, anywhere. He became an engineer, and he was, I would think, one of Canada's best ever engineers. Quite a remarkable guy. I told you about the Banff Lake Louise Road. His second major highway was one called the Rogers Pass. And my father used to believe you could not build a road unless you walked on it first. You had to walk it before you actually started building it. He didn't build it from topographical maps. He walked over it. So I said one time, well, how many times did you go through it? And he said, well, I went through twice. Once very quickly and once not so quickly. I said, well, what was the difference? He said, well, the second time I remembered to take a rifle. because he actually was sort of chased out of it by the bears, and he learned his lesson. But his next highway was the Dempster Highway, which you might know is the first highway in the world that goes over the Arctic Circle and actually connects up with the Nunavik in the far north. He loved the Yukon with a real passion. He was relocated, forced by the government to relocate to Vancouver, and my mother to this day swears that it took 10 years off his life. He hated it. Hated the city, hated commuting, hated everything about it. He was happy in small towns. And he was a talented, capable, really rich individual. So let me talk a little bit about rural challenges. I'm not going to go very much on this because this is, you all know this, and it's something you live with all the time. First off, the population decline that we see in rural Canada is global in nature. It is happening all around the world. Last year, about 18 months ago, the first time in world history that more than half the people lived in urban areas. So we're in the middle of a global transition as people move into cities. It isn't common everywhere. And it's kind of interesting that countries that have social democratic traditions, in other words, countries that devote themselves to distributing income, so people are not as vulnerable to sort of economic changes. Countries like Denmark and Norway and New Zealand, which has changed in recent years, have really strong rural areas. Not everybody sort of goes down this particular path. I noticed Stats Canada has actually changed its definition of we used to call them cities or urban areas, and they now call them population centers. And I thought, well, what does that mean where you live? So their population centers are your non-population centers. It's a very odd description. What's also interesting about rural areas, when you actually look back over the last 40 or 50 years, and people talk about the problems in rural areas, they said, well, you got to fix shopping. We can't do anything here because there's no shopping, right? Well, we have the internet now. You can shop absolutely everything you want in close to that. We got that one solved. Well, there's no entertainment. You might have had a movie theater down the street, but that probably closed down about 1990, 1885, 1990, something like that. But who cares now? You got Netflix and all these other kind of internet services, what have you. Isolation. Now, I remember, some of you, well, 5 of you in this room are older than me. I remember when people used to have to write letters to set up long-distance phone calls. Some of you remember doing that? You used to write letters and say, we're going to call you at this time and get Christmas, we used to make 1 or 2 phone calls, and we just passed the phone. Each family member got to say hello to every other family member, and one of our family members had 11 people in it. And so that's all we did, was say hello for 15 minutes and then hang up. The next challenge is healthcare. Healthcare, we don't have enough healthcare system. The doctors don't have enough doctors, don't have enough nurses. Well, to be honest, if you actually look 10 years down the line, that one's going to take care of itself. About 90% of your healthcare is going to be done on your smartphone, which is kind of interesting. It's going to be interesting adaptation. It'll get rid of another challenge. Education is often identified. Our schools aren't good enough. They're not big enough. We don't have enough options, enough credits for somebody who wants to go on to specialized programs. So it's kind of interesting because each one of those we're addressing. We've actually changed them. We've improved them. And still the criticisms about rural life continue. Other challenges, the withdrawal of professionals, trying to get professionals to move into rural areas. My daughter-in-law is a doctor. She actually specialized in rural medicine. She really wanted to work in rural areas. I thought that was really fantastic. I was so proud of her until I discovered that meant rural medicine in southern Ontario. And rural in southern Ontario meant you were about it was rural if you were more than a 45-minute drive from a significant hospital, which wasn't the kind of rural I kind of thought she had in mind. And she now lives in Ottawa, which is really well known as a rural area. But getting people, what was interesting was when she was graduating, they would come down to the McMaster Medical School and bribe the doctors. And maybe some of you are bribers. But it was really interesting. She got offered chunks of land on waterfront land. Got offered all her student loans would be paid off. They'd be given a staff and all that kind of stuff. And they still had trouble getting people to go into rural areas. Most of them, if they went, would only stay a short time. We also have a real challenge over the national image of rural life. We live in a country that is preoccupied with urban priorities and investing in urban sort of challenges. I've been following the debate over climate change intensely the last little while. And if you notice when they talk about solutions, they're talking about urban solutions. Unless Pouce Coupe is actually planning a transit system, I don't think you're actually talking about Pouce Coupe when they're actually talking about urban transit and as a way of addressing climate change. It just doesn't fit in. There's also, and I've been sort of trying to sort of get some attention on this, a lack of respect for the energy realities of rural life. Now, people talk about, they're driving cars, we're going to get people out of their cars. Have they ever been in a rural area? Do they really know what it's like? And you have to drive a long distance between operations and what have you. That whole idea that Canada, it will always be. I heard one of our prime minister was talking about climate change. We're going to be a world leader in reducing our expenses. It's not going to work. Our consumption of natural gas, and so we can do a little bit around it. But in case you haven't noticed, we're a pretty cold country, right? And they have to turn the heat up or die. It's very, very simple. We're a large country. If you want to get from one place to the other, you drive a long way. Folks who are coming down from up north, it's an 8-hour drive to get down here. We are not going to change those realities in Canada at all, unless we all move into Toronto. And having spent 6 years in Southern Ontario, please don't do that. The single worst thing about all of Canada is actually the 401 highway outside of Toronto, which is just a pure indication that we can't solve even those basic challenges before us. Another part of this whole process is watching what happens to new Canadians. Canada is one of the world's most generous countries in attracting people from overseas. We take in a lot of people who have specialized education, specialized training, fit into sort of niches in our economy. We have a very robust refugee policy. You'll notice the 25,000 Syrians. And go and look at where they're settling. And the fact that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, are settling in about 5 or 6 cities. They're now doing some movement into smaller centers, but not into sort of rural areas. We're losing the cultural battles. My daughter makes me listen to Taylor Swift about 8,000 times a day. I could sing her songs, and that would empty this room faster than you wouldn't believe. But those songs, Taylor Swift is always talking about how the losers stay in the small towns and the winners get to go to the big cities. You should be celebrating rural life, and instead we're doing sort of just the opposite. And on the future, when we talk about the future, some of our best philosophers or visionaries about the future, you may have read some of Richard Florida's work, basically say that rural areas are dead, that we're moving into an innovation economy, an economy driven by science and technology, and that in that imagination that all good things are going to happen in cities. Universities get together with business. You put lots of creative people together. They obviously haven't been at the Banff Center. You put all these kind of things together, and you create real energy and real excitement. And then by definition, they're saying the rural areas haven't got a chance. That innovation meaning creating jobs, using new technologies to create work and what have you, basically is not going to work. So I have a problem with this. And my problem is really, really simple. I think it's wrong. And I think it's okay to be a city person. I have no problem with people that like cities. We should have a few of them in every country. But I actually have a problem with the way we're deprecating rural life and the way we're sort of making people who live in rural areas sound as though they're not contributing fully, aren't participating fully, aren't sort of part of the future of Canada. And there's reasons for people thinking that. You know, in Saskatchewan, we've closed more than 100 communities. The governments pulled all their services out back when the province was really, really poor. But, you know, I look at it in a personal sense, and this is going to come back to some of the celebrating the real value and vitality of rural life. In a university environment, I have a lot of opportunity to speak to young people. And one of those fascinating things is asking people about, you know, what did they do when they were young? What did they do when they were growing up in high school? And it's really interesting because the people that live in cities basically have nothing to say. You know, well, I lived in a house and I walked down the street and I went to school and then I came home and I worked at McDonald's and then I went to university and now I'm dead. That's life. It's very, very simple. Talk to a kid from a rural area. You teach them all. They're all in your schools, right? And they're fishing and they're hunting and they're canoeing and they're going out in the bush and they're doing all these things and they're working in the garage and they're fixing cars and they're doing 1,000 things. Less than they used to. If we could get rid of Facebook and video games, this would be a much, much better world. And we had to work on that one at some point. But people in rural areas actually have qualitatively different life histories. They have actually done way more things. So I think we have to sort of figure out how we actually make education a central part of the rediscovery of the value of rural society. I was looking at the curriculum the other day, at the high school curriculum in Ontario, and they had almost nothing in the reading, in the history section or in the literature section that actually reflected rural realities. They'd actually taken a lot of the old stuff out when we used to read Stephen Leacock and Sinclair Ross, and so that's For Me and My House and W.O. Mitchell. Most of that stuff's gone, and we now, and it's really good stuff they're replacing it with, but it's actually about new Canadians and their experience of coming into Canada. So Japanese Canadians, Chinese Canadians, Caribbean Canadians. But I also grew up, and this is another part I'll just throw at you before we start talking about how we fight back, that there's a lot of assumptions about the low quality of rural education. Whitehorse is not it's a small town. The time was about 21,000 when I lived there, so it isn't rural in the way that many of your communities are rural. But just a personal experience to tie this down. My last day of high school, I was just cleaning up my locker, and one of my grade 12 teachers kind of came down the hall and sort of said, "Oh, what are you doing next, Ken?" And I said, I sort of puffed up like 17-year-old boys tend to puff up, and I said, "No, I'm going to UBC. I'm registered in pre-law." So I still to this day can remember the look on his face. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh," he said, "well, you're going to fail." And then he said, "Well, we do the best we can up here. We try. We haven't got enough resources, so just get ready to fail. And then so when you before you go down, sort of try to have a job lined up, for the fall or for next winter or next summer." Well, I wish I could tell you I was really brave and strong and changed over to neuropsychology or something like that. So actually I went out of pre-law and I went into phys ed. And whenever I say that and people take a look at me, they laugh, and that really hurts my feelings. But I was as brave as I could be. At least I thought, he must know, but he's just gone through university. He must know, so I'm going to change. The only chance I have is actually getting through and playing games and playing. It took me about 2 years to realize that folks from the Yukon were just as smart as anybody else, and we were just as prepared, and I got out of that. So 20 years later, I was the vice president academic at the University of Northern British Columbia, and we were promoting universities throughout northern Canada, so I was going to all the small towns. And I went to Tumbler Ridge in northern British Columbia, and I told the story I just told you. It's a northern mining town, relatively small place, and I just told that story, and I said, don't ever let anybody, don't let a teacher, that guy was a teacher, don't let the community tell you that you are a lesser person because you've been raised in a small town. There is nothing with that experience that will actually limit your life. And I said, and if anybody ever says that to you, I want you to phone me and let me know. And this student stood up in the front row and he said, and this is not the teacher's name, he said, "That Mr. Brown, he's leaving the room right now, he's running away. He just told us that last week." Damn his eyes, damn his eyes. What kids do, what teachers can do to destroy the visions and the optimism and the enthusiasm of youth with only a phrase is really astonishing. I know you don't do that and don't let that happen. We have to show that our schools in rural areas are committed to preparing young people for the 21st century. The one thing I'll tell you about this, by the way, is that young people are really scared. They're not quite as scared as their parents, and their parents are traumatized. We live in a world of sort of career paranoia, where the parents are worried all the time. Will my kids get a job? What will they do? Will they get a decent salary? Will they have to move to overseas or what have you? And we're really fighting really hard against that. So we're going to have to fight for rural too. And that's the part I wanted to spend the rest of the time talking about. So rural areas are not for everybody. Every one of you has had somebody who moved into town who just didn't fit in. They were absolutely classic urban people. If there wasn't a Starbucks on every corner, they basically couldn't imagine that they could even survive. If you really want to succeed as a society, keep Starbucks out of your town. For some reason, they sort of just bring everything down to a low level. My daughter spends all her time in Starbucks, drives me crazy. Second thing is, we cannot wait for governments to solve the problems of rural Canada. The problems of rural Canada are as much psychological, they're as much in our own heads, in how we talk, what we do about our future, and how we take control of our destiny. The reality is that the cities dominate the political agendas in Canada all across the board. I say this without any partisan sort of side because the last Conservative government will probably be the last federal government in Canada dominated by people from rural areas. And if you'll notice over the last sort of 10 years, and including the Liberal time, the 10 years before that, we didn't exactly have a lot of great rural policies in this country. It's just when you get to the top 10 list of the things that really matter, you'll find that governments are putting most of their emphasis where the people are. The large groups of people in the Montreals and the Torontos and the Vancouvers, Calgarys and Edmonton and what have you. So the next thing associated with that is when you're going to fight for the future, we have to be more than complainers. It's really easy to sort of look back and say, we don't have this and we don't have this and we don't have that. My experience in following and monitoring governments for a very long time is that governments respond to, and the public responds to ideas. They don't respond to complaints. It's really easy to identify the problems. It's much harder to identify solutions and practical answers going forward. And I think the way to start is by identifying the positive sides, not thinking about all the challenges. And I could have given a much longer list, and you're all sitting here saying, he didn't mention this, he didn't mention this. There's a lot of real problems in rural areas. There's a lot of real problems in cities as well. But what we have to do is define the strengths. So what is the rural advantage, at least as I see it? And I've got about 10 things here. Again, you can add to the list and might challenge some of the things that I've said. Number one, and I think this is the most important, is the powerful sense of community. People basically look after each other. They know each other. They care for each other. They pay attention to each other. Sometimes they pay a little bit too much attention to each other. But ultimately, there's sort of a collective responsibility for helping people out in hard times. And every one of you, I'm guaranteed, either has had a case for yourself where that happened, where people actually stepped in to help you and your family, or where you were part of a process of helping people in your community. That does happen in cities from time to time, but nowhere near as often as before. Rural areas have real talent. One of the neat things in small town schools is that every one of you knows that there's every year or 2 or 3 years, there's this incredibly brilliant person, a young woman of transcendental talent and ability, and just radiant individual who comes through. And, the next year it's a guy, and 5 years later it's a girl back again, or whatever it happens to be. That talent has to be identified and unleashed and mobilized. I had the good fortune, some of you may remember Gordon Teason, who was the governor of the Bank of Canada, and I was raised in a small town in Saskatchewan, and when I was working at the University of Saskatchewan before, we were talking about this, and he just said, being in a small town was the best thing that ever happened to me. And he said, I was like everybody else. I have some talents, and I have no talents. There's some things I could do and some things I can't do. And he said, what happened to me was that year after year, the teachers kept building on the talents and telling me the things I was good at, and telling me the things I should never stop doing, and telling me the things I should try harder on. And in a small town, the grade 9 teacher talks to the grade 10 teacher, talks to the grade 11 teacher, talks to the grade 12 teacher. And Gordon Teason says, he grew up in a family that hadn't sent anybody to university, didn't really have that in their mindset, had no idea of what economics was, and his teachers basically created in him, they took a talent bubble, sort of a piece of plasticine that had full of potential, and they just created something magnificent. Gordon Teason is one of the smartest people I've ever met. The next thing I would say, and this is one that we don't pay much attention to, if you live in a city, you basically, this is not unofficial, you're really only allowed to do 2 things, putting family as something else. You can have your job, and if you're lucky, you can do one other thing. You be politically active, get into your church, do a sport, something like that. In rural areas, and you all know this, you have to do everything, right? If you actually even make the mistake of showing up at a political rally, the next thing you know, you're the president of the riding association, if not the candidate, right? But also, if you're in high school, your daughter's in high school, and your daughter says, my dad really likes photography. The next thing you know, somebody's phoning from the local photography club and saying, I understand you like photography. And if you talk to people, and you're all those people, you realize, I do this, and I curl. Well, I'm in the church. Well, the church needs somebody to look after the finances. I'll look after the finances, right? And on and on and on. And I believe that one of the real strengths of rural communities is that you actually recognize and reward the entire person. It's really hard to get noticed for everything in a big city. It's impossible not to get noticed in a small town. And you end up with very full, very complete individuals. What's the other rural advantage? Practice with trial and error. Young people experiment. They watch the farmers experiment. They watch the loggers experiment. They watch the oil and gas people experiment. They watch the miners experiment. There is a real practical application of knowledge in some very important situations. The best and most obvious answer is just comfort with machinery. Again, I'm always sounding so critical of urban people. If I was, what's that Foxworthy guy? I should do one of those not white people say I should do something about urban people and make up some bad stories. But I like urban people. They're nice to visit. But one of the best examples is just driving. The comfort that young people in smaller areas have with driving. So I got my learner's permit when I was 14. In the Yukon, you're allowed to get it when you were 14. By the time I drove at 16, my father didn't like driving, and he would get in the car and say, we're going there to Watson Lake, which was 5 hours away, and he'd fall asleep. And so at 14 years old, I'm racing down the Alaska Highway gravel road in the middle of the winter, like this, right? And by the time I got my license, I'd probably driven 20,000 miles. Well, in a city, in a modern way. You're not allowed to do that anymore. You can't get a learner's permit until you're 15, and then all these rules, and you can only drive with other people in the car and all that kind of stuff. But a great example came from Saskatchewan, where the Premier, Brad Wall, was talking in a public meeting one time, and he says, what's going on is that my son was on the farm on the weekend. He's 12 years old, and I was showing him how to drive the tractor, and I put him in the pickup truck and let him drive out to the back farm, right? And so, well, you guys are saying, what's the big deal, right? So one of the other politicians from the other party sort of stood up, and it's almost like a point of privileges. Does the Premier know that he's breaking the law? And that 13-year-old should not be in a car and should not be driving a vehicle. And the Premier was sort of like, oh, get real. Don't you know what Saskatchewan is all about, right? Learn to comfort with machines, be comfortable around technology and what have you. There is something, when I lived in New Zealand for 2 years, there was something called the Kiwi Spirit. And the Kiwi Spirit basically said, if you give me two things, baling wire and duct tape, I can fix anything ever made by humanity. A little baling wire, a little bit of duct tape can fix absolutely everything. We have that same fixer mentality in rural areas. Why? Well, because the hardware store's 87 miles away. And if something's broken down, you have to fix it, and you have to make it go. That part is really important as we get into what we call the maker society, using new technologies. The connection that rural people have to the outdoors. Even if they don't go hunting and fishing and trapping, you just get used to being around the outdoors all the time. We also get people in rural areas work across socioeconomic lines. My best friends in high school included the children of doctors and lawyers and politicians in town. They all included truck drivers and unemployed people, and just about everybody you could imagine across a broad cross-section of society. My daughter, lovely girl, goes to a school in Saskatoon, and if the socioeconomic system in Saskatoon is this big, she goes to a school where everybody fits into this little corner. It's all the same. We have what we call first world problems. My mascara is running. No, that's a first world problem. And it isn't kind of the one that somebody who hasn't got food to eat that day has to face in a different way. I think rural areas benefit from smallness. Smallness can be a curse. The whole business of like everybody knows your business and everybody's involved with your business. I had a friend running for public office, and somebody decided to run against him because they'd had a fight in high school about 18 years before. And so he ran against him and defeated him, and he was a premier of a territory. And he got taken down for a high school fight from a long, long time ago, which really didn't seem very fair. But there's a benefit to smallness. I mentioned before about the access to teachers, the fact that the teachers know what's going on. They know the family circumstance. They actually know that if somebody gets laid off in one of the plants down the street, that the kids might be having some struggles with this. That is a huge, huge benefit. The best students get extra attention. The weakest students get extra attention. People of real potential get pushed forward. You can push, sometimes resisting it a lot, but they get real opportunities to go forward. And at the student level, it's very common for students to have great access to community leaders. They know the mayors, they know the city councilors, they know the school board trustees. They know all these people, and they get to work with them in a regular basis. Two other ones that I think are really important. Number one is the work experience. I was at the University of Waterloo for 6 years, and Waterloo is one of the great universities in North America. It's a fabulous place. And it has the world's largest co-op education program. Co-op education means that you study for 4 months and work for 4 months, study, work, study, work, study, work. And the unemployment rate of graduates from Waterloo is half that of other universities. Waterloo graduates get paid more money because they have work experience. 25% of the students who come to the co-op program, which is work intensive, have never had a job. And one of the things that separates rural kids, in my experience as a teacher, from urban kids is work ethic. They actually know how to work. Why? Well, because their uncle used to make them work. Their father worked in the forest sector and had them working. People had to work. They worked in a very extensive way. That practical work experience and work ethic is really a serious problem. I could flip over and talk about universities for a while and tell you we have a huge problem with young people going to university. The work ethic is not up to snuff. Their commitment is just not there. What's really interesting with rural kids is sometimes they have their skill sets are lower, but the work ethic is way higher. And so if you take the time to sort of push them forward, it works generally fairly well. But let me talk about one that I think is really critical. It's connections with First Nations. Most of you have at least one reserve, sometimes two, sometimes three within your school district. This actually is going to be one of the defining characteristics of 21st century Canada. We have done a miserable job providing real opportunities and quality of life experiences for Aboriginal people. The poverty levels are outrageous. The problems with education in terms of the federally funded education, you all know all of those kinds of things. Really severe problem. And this is not about pointing blame. The blame goes back into the 18th century and the 19th century and the early 20th century. It's Indian Acts and reserves and residential schools. It's not about what somebody did in your community last week. But First Nations, because of the laws around duty to consult and accommodate, because of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, they will be a huge part of the Canadian economy going forward. You want a pipeline built? Talk to First Nations. Oil and gas exploration, mineral development, forestry development, work with First Nations. I just don't believe that we're going to get a lot of solutions coming out of the cities. People who don't have direct experience with First Nations come up with unrealistic ideas. Some First Nations are extremely talented and very capable and very engaged with the 21st century economy. Some are really suffering, and they haven't got the right leadership. But you're the ones that know that, because you work with the reality of First Nations lives. And we need the engagement with First Nations directly, with Métis people. We need the personal connections, and that's much stronger in rural areas. So what do we do about it? So number one point I would make is that when you start thinking about what you want to do, pay close attention at the provincial and federal level to the agendas of those governments. They're unlikely to create a rural agenda just for you, or for all the rural people in Canada. They're not going to come and say, what are we going to do for all those small towns and all those rural areas? They're not going to do that. They've got a different priority list, and I'll just identify three things. And I'm going to suggest here that if you want something out of government, don't get them focusing on your priorities. You look at their priorities. What are they trying to do? And then take your needs and put them into that context and put it into that request. Number one, innovation in the new economy. As we watch the old economy, manufacturing has collapsed in Ontario and Quebec over the last 10 or 15 years. And the old economy of oil and gas and mining is in serious trouble sort of right now. Governments want to create a new economy. They want an innovation-driven economy. What request can you put forward that matches up with that? Social responsiveness. How can governments respond to social challenges, tensions within society as a whole? In that particular one, I think rural areas can lead Canada on the Aboriginal file. There's no question in my mind that the solutions in terms of real relationships with Aboriginal people that work and that are sustainable will actually come from rural areas. And I'll tell you, the provinces, the federal government need help on that one very, very seriously. And this is one you guys are really, really good at, doing more with less. This is going to be the mantra for the next decade in Canada. We're all talking about taking deficits and doing infrastructure spending, but the actual ongoing spending is going to be quite limited, probably for at least the next decade. How do you adjust to smaller and unstable budgets? Well, actually, ask you guys. You've been doing with that for a very, very long time. And in fact, rural life generally requires that. So how do you build rural citizens? And what can we actually do to build rural citizens among our students? And I say this by suggesting that one of our challenges is to make sure that we tell young people that living in a rural area is a good thing. To a degree that you probably would be dismayed to discover that isn't what they're getting taught now. Some teachers do it, but actually if you have 10 teachers over the course of a year and one of them really thinks rural life sucks hard, that's the one they're going to remember. That's the one that's going to stick in their mind and really upset them as they sort of go forward. So what do you do? Review the portrayal of rural life in curriculum. What is the school curriculum saying about rural life? Is it a positive portrayal, a negative portrayal? Is it a harsh one? Is it a fair one, etc.? I'm always intrigued when I look at where people go on field trips that almost all the rural field trips are to cities. Oh, let's give our kids some civilization. Let's take them to Calgary now. There's a contradiction in terms. We should actually take kids on field trips to other small towns. To actually go and find another small town that's trying to do what your community wants to do. If your community is not very engaged in the digital economy, go to Olds. Go to Olds, watch what Olds College and the Old City of Community of Olds is trying to do. Go to other rural areas and get their kids thinking about other rural communities. Don't fill them with the idea that good things happen in cities and the rural areas are struggling to catch up. If you have incorporated project learning into your curriculum, and I'm sure you have, it's the cutting edge of sort of contemporary education, focus on rural problems and rural problem solving. It's really important. I'm a big fan of thinking of ways you can in your own communities extend grade 12. At some point, we're going to find a situation where many high schools in rural areas actually offer first-year university, often through distance education programs. Some of you are probably doing that already. My preference actually is to have first and second year actually at home. Cuts the cost way down. If you haven't noticed this yet, the phrase we'll use around universities is that for young boys, 18 is the new 15. The boys are really, really struggling. There's a reason why 60 to 65% of all these university students are female, and why even a higher percentage of the graduates are female, and why most of the scholarship winners are female, and why most of the people getting into law school, and medical school, veterinary school, dentistry school are female. I mean, it starts off with the fact that women are smarter than men, so that's sort of a fairly easy way to go. But the reality of it is young men are way behind. And we send them off to university at a time when they're actually really vulnerable. And so the dropout rate is way too high. And if you can look at ways of sort of incorporating first and second year university, first and second year college programs, through distance education and what have you, into your high schools, you'd actually would root the kids more in the rural areas as you go forward. You can recruit and then if you can't find them, create them rural-ready teachers. We do a lot of orientation for teachers after graduation, and it's too late. You know, you have to get kids out there on practicums. You have to make sure, and you have to test them to make sure they're rural-ready going forward. I think when we shift to a competency-based education system, which again is one of the great trends that we're seeing going on, we're going to discover that rural skills contribute to a lot of those competencies better than urban skills. And that's a way of, again, highlighting that in the curriculum and promoting it going forward. Similarly, we can connect schools to the world of work even easier in rural areas than we can in small towns. We have a real problem, too, that when the kids come to university, they tend not to come home. Particularly acute for Aboriginal communities. Aboriginal people, when they leave their communities and go to university or go to college in a city, the overwhelming number never go home again. And so you have to be intentional about this. One of my great strategies for that is that at the point of graduation, you should work with local employers and city government and whatever else, and give your very, very best students a 4-year summer scholarship where they're guaranteed summer jobs coming home. Kids are having trouble finding summer jobs. And so if you've got some really bright, talented kid from your community, and at their high school graduation, you say, this young lady has received a 4-year work scholarship, and when she goes off, every summer she gets to come back. If you don't do that, they'll find a summer job in the city, and you may not see them again. If the community makes a commitment to them, they're likely to make a commitment to you as well. We should learn to celebrate the success of rural people. It's a category we almost never talk about. We talk about successful Canadians, most of them living in the United States, unfortunately. We talk about successful Aboriginal people, and as we should. We talk about successful women, successful new Canadians. These are all categories we're used to. We haven't got a culture yet of really celebrating successful rural people, particularly ones who are successful in their home region, who are building success, building jobs and opportunities right close to home. One of the things we also don't do is we don't go after the people from our communities who are wealthy and left the communities and did really well. In every one of your communities there, if you went back over 20 years, you probably could identify, 10, 15, 20, 30 people who left your community, went away, and became millionaires. Well, get them, find them, bring them home, and get them to invest back at home. And if you want to see a really wonderful example, has anybody heard of Fogo Island? Anybody here heard of Fogo Island at all? Have you been there? Oh, it's beautiful, right? So Fogo Island is an island off Newfoundland. It's in the middle, way out. We have to take a bunch of ferries to get there. It's really hard to get there. A lady named Zita Cohen, who made hundreds of millions of dollars in the high-tech sector, as a way of helping her own community, basically came back and built 5 stars isn't enough to describe what kind of a hotel it is, and it's an artistic retreat. Absolutely spectacular buildings in a spectacular setting, and attracts people from all around the world. And this was her way of giving back to the community. And it's kind of interesting. I'll use one final example in this regard. We have to go out of our way to actually tell young people we want them to come home. We want them to stay. And this is not a partisan comment because he's new Prime Minister and we'll train him over time. But one of the things, when Prime Minister Trudeau was in Davos, he said 2 things that really upset me. One of them was, and he loves slogans. He loves sort of short slogans that sort of capture his value set. And he said, we've been known for our resources and we want to be known for our resourcefulness. So we have one of the most resourceful resource sectors in the planet. And in fact, we've exported our technology and our abilities all over the place. So resourcefulness and resources are not separate things. We've made hundreds of billions of dollars in this country by actually being resourceful in the use of our resources. And so that one kind of upset me a lot. If you look at what's going on in agriculture, agriculture is one of the most tech-heavy areas. And not just the machines, but the digital technologies that are sort of coming along and being introduced. It's fabulous, fabulous sort of stuff. The second thing that he said that really upset me was he was bragging about the University of Waterloo. And he said, University of Waterloo produces these great graduates, and they're great engineers, and they're great entrepreneurs, and we know they're great because they're all going down to Silicon Valley. No other country in the world, guaranteed, no other country in the world would brag about the fact that some of its best and brightest people were leaving. I was in Scandinavia when he said that, and the Norwegians and the Finns and the Swedes were like, and has he been fired yet? You can imagine the president of Finland standing up and saying, we're really successful. Because all our really good people are going to Germany. He would be fired for something like that. And in fact, in Canada, we said, oh yeah, that's good. I'll go to Waterloo, so I'll send my kid to Waterloo so he can leave. And she can go down and live in Seattle or something like that. Just to pull something from Mr. Trudeau, we have to make a point of telling young people we want them to stay. And if they're going to go away to get a college diploma or a degree or a university degree, tell them, please do that, but please come back again. And every time when the school board trustee president stands up at the graduation ceremony, tell them to come home. Tell them you need them. Tell them you want them. You're the ones that created a great life for them, created life opportunities for them. Tell them you want them to stay in Canada, and you want them to help build rural Canada for the future. You have to do that. We don't do that in Canada. We celebrate way too easily the people that leave and go away. I spend a lot of time in Scandinavia, and it's interesting watching the way they do exactly the opposite, the way they promote people to stay close to home and in their areas. So it's up to you. The future of rural Canada actually doesn't sit in the hands of provincial governments. It doesn't sit in the hands of industry. It doesn't sit in the hands of even local politicians. They're really important. It actually sits in the schools. Because if you can create the right atmosphere in rural schools, if you can use the school system to reinforce and celebrate the very best of what rural society has to offer, you can actually promote commitment and enthusiasm about rural areas. Right now, it's really interesting. I was in Northern Ontario. Northern Ontario is any place more than about 40 miles outside of Toronto. And I was about 50 miles outside of Toronto. And I was giving this sort of kind of talk. And what was interesting is one of the school trustees that I was speaking to stood up and he said that, they'd actually talked to the guidance counselors. And the message from the guidance counselors was, if you want to have a decent life, you have to leave. That you have to plan to go to university and college and look for, because there won't be any opportunities in the small towns. Well, if you say that, you're going to guarantee it. If that's the mindset that the community has, or the counselors have, or the teachers have, and the kids have, it'll happen. They'll leave, and they won't come back. And you'll suffer as a consequence. You have to make sure that young people see rural areas and rural communities as a key and wonderful option for themselves. You have to let them show that you care about their future. If in your schools, talk about jobs. We know the parents are paranoid about it. We know the kids are paranoid about it. My daughter, again, I love my daughter. She's 15 years old. And she comes home all the time reporting on conversations, not that they're having with the teachers, but they're having with each other. And she said, I only got 96, like on my math score, like. You have any kids that use like all the time? It's the worst word in the English vocabulary. And she's saying, I got 96, will I still be able to get into university? Yeah, don't worry, kid. You're going to be just fine. And then but I need to get into university, and the right university, I'm not going to get a good job. Oh, stop it. Just stop it. She's in grade 9. Don't panic about this kind of stuff going forward. The key thing that I would really push on you is that your schools have to be the absolute centerpiece of emerging technologies. You have to watch what's coming down the line. Every school, if you don't already have one, should have at least 1, 2, or 3 3D printers. When you start realizing that they are actually using 3D printers to print bridges, they're using 3D printers to print airplane engines, and to think of all the practical applications of 3D printers, your school should be the most innovative places in the world in using 3D printers to solve local problems. And I think you have to also develop a reputation, and yet your students see this, for collaborative approaches. You must model the future relationship with First Nations. You and your schools should model the relationship with industry and with employers as much as you possibly can. You must be, because the rural areas are facing serious political challenges, serious economic challenges, social and cultural challenges. Only way you can respond is to be the most creative, the most innovative, and most forward-looking institutions anywhere in the country. So I celebrate you as rural citizens, and those of you who are managing rural schools. Rural Alberta has many, many advantages. Learn to celebrate them, to champion them, to improve upon them, and to make things better. The future of Canada needs confidence, it needs assertiveness, and it needs excitement about what's coming down the line. That is your job. You cannot walk away from it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ken. That certainly has given us a lot to chew on. At this point, Ken's agreed to spend a few minutes to answer questions. The last time he spoke, he certainly generated a few, and I don't think this will be any different. So if there are any questions that you have, just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you so you can ask the questions. So I'll turn it over to Ken just for a few more minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Post, for your inspiring presentation and talk that you provided. Certainly, it was excellent from you. One of the questions that I have for you, we were talking about how to build the right concept. We talked about announcements like first and second year, post-secondary, and whether or not they have to be at the university or at home. Those are individuals who have tremendous interest in doing that post-secondary realm. What two things that you're saying are talents? You know, Canadian perspective. These are things that we can do and take action on to support our communities and helping us to stay there and still move forward in our third and fourth year.
Number one thing I would do is have them come and live with you for 6 months. Because people have to understand what they're actually trying to address. If people haven't lived in rural areas and haven't spent a fair bit of time there, they're just going to deal with those stereotypes. Which is not very helpful. Now, that's not very realistic, and you actually go forward. But the second thing is we actually have the courseware already in hand. We don't have to, it doesn't cost any more money. We have thousands and thousands of online courses that are created elsewhere. And so we just need to assemble what's there and make it available as a package. The third thing we need to do is to convince governments and universities and colleges not to be preoccupied with huge numbers. So you know what happens at first-year university? Many of you will have been to university. And my older daughter went to the University of Toronto. In the first year, her average class size was 350 students in the whole class. Her largest class was 800 students. And the University of Toronto has classes as large as 1,800. Okay? So kids are coming out of your schools. How do you think you're going to adjust to that? Like, that's just being outer space, right, in terms of a practical sort of application. So we have to look at sort of what is in the long-term interest of the students in Canadian society and not focus on numbers. So I'll give you an example, because we've done this. We've actually created a master's degree for northern Saskatchewan. And the students can live in northern, they don't have to come down to the university, they can stay at home. And they study a combination. We take our professors up north, we bring the students down south, and most of the stuff is actually done over online, right? And it's actually been absolutely astonishing. We had 45 applications for 12 spots, which is extraordinarily high in a university sort of setting. We have the highest graduation rate of any master's program at the University of Saskatchewan. And in the 5 years it's been going, we can already see the transformative effects on the region. Because if those people had to quit their jobs, move away from their families, come down to the University of Saskatchewan and take their courses face-to-face, first off, they wouldn't come, most of them. If they did come, it would be extremely expensive and difficult for them. And thirdly, if they came down, they probably wouldn't go back again. Right? And so the interesting thing about my suggestion is we have all the potential is right there. The biggest thing I would say, because you did ask for practical things, is to find new ways of having conversations between institutions. School boards talking to colleges, talking to universities, talking to individual departments and what have you, so that you actually can sort of create those kind of packages. When I went to university way a long time ago, 1974, it was either 10 or 12 of us from the Yukon went down to UBC. 2 of us lasted 8 months. Everybody else went home. And everybody said, well, of course you went home. You're neighbors to the Beverly Hillbillies. You came from the far north. What do you expect? It had nothing to do with academic potential. My friends were smart people. They could have handled it. They couldn't handle a city of 1.2 million people. And particularly now when the maturity level, I hate to say this, but the maturity level of young people is lower than it has been before. And so I think we need to give them a better chance to adapt. And I think we all the tools are there. Institutional barriers are sort of the major challenge. Yeah. Good luck. So let's start with the challenge and then come back with the possibilities. One of the things that we're seeing is technology is replacing jobs very, very quickly. And the best estimate we have is that within 25 years, 50% of the current jobs in North America can be replaced with machines. Okay, so that's getting pretty scary. And the number one place it's going to work on is transportation. The taxis, having smart cars and all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to see not just the movement into the cities as people are looking for, they think there's more jobs there, but we're going to see fewer jobs even in the cities because of the technology. So now we're getting to the phase of sort of the use of the internet that has real potential. So I'm going to use an extreme example and then a less extreme example. The extreme example is remote surgery. There's nothing in the world stopping you from actually opening up a clinic in your town, letting doctors come in and make huge salaries while they work and do surgery all across Canada. You sit at a computer terminal and you sit there and you take out somebody's liver from thousands of miles away. That's technology that exists today. It isn't something we have to wait for down the line. It actually does. Now, how many of you are willing to sort of jump up on the table and have me take out your kidneys? That's the problem, right? It's that kind of a problem. But we can use the technology that way. But, video games, this is where those kids who are playing video games, particularly young boys who spend all their time playing video games, this is actually where that technology is going to transform the world of work. We're actually going to be able to do an awful lot of our work using video game technology. And that work is completely disassociated from location. You can literally be anywhere. Right now, the closest we have to that is call centers. And before, they used to try to get call centers at big football stadium kind of place with everybody talking together. And a whole bunch of the call centers now basically give their people a software program and say, get a quiet room in the basement and close the door. They're starting to do it at home, right? So we can start looking at how you can replace jobs and move them to wherever people are. But just to give you another example of this, happened in Saskatchewan. There was a company that had about 200 employees. They basically do billing for trucking companies. And they got all the paper in and did all the processing. They were bought by an Ontario-based company who immediately closed their shop down. And they do everything with BlackBerries and cell phones. And the whole thing's done automatically. So we have to worry about the loss of jobs through those kinds of things, and we have to start exploring what the world of work looks like using digital technologies. And I personally think a lot of this stuff is going to be remote control, where you actually can operate things. Australia has mines that are operated 1,500 miles away from the mine site. It's called autonomous mining. So there's no reason in the world why your community can't have 100 people working in a remote mine at some point in the fairly near future. So that's the challenge is, I can't say, go to this company and hire 20 of them. You have to look at where that technology is going and what's going to actually be created. And our biggest barrier right now is we think video games are kids' toys. And if you actually look at them, we're using a lot of video games for training. Your pilots are trained with video games. Your soldiers are trained with using video games. There's a whole bunch of that stuff coming down the line. And I find it really scary at the one hand and then really exciting at the other. Because everybody who studies this basically says we're going to end up with way fewer jobs at the end of the day. And that doesn't make me feel very comfortable. And that's why there's career paranoia. So it wasn't a very precise answer to your question, because all it does is make more confusion. But again, I would if how many people in your school divisions have 3D printers available for student use? No, that's great. That's great. I mean, the future with 3D printing, when they're printing off ears now. You can actually print off body parts using 3D printers. And so the technology, where does that take us? I don't know. The other one, by the way, is we actually have the technology to put a little tiny robot inside your body and manipulate it from a distance, and then actually go looking for cancer cells and polyps and stuff like that, which is vastly preferable to colonoscopy. So there's lots of future opportunities. Sure. Okay, that's a really great question. When I look at this a lot, and part of what I'm seeing is that culturally we haven't prepared young men to be defeated by women, and so they tend to give up. And they don't like getting beaten by women. And my daughter was born in Vietnam. I'm not trying to personalize every single answer. My daughter was born in Vietnam, and when she does well in school, she works really, really hard. And which says, well, the boys keep coming, you're just Asian. You know, and Hannah says, well, I'm not Asian. Well, you know, look at me. Do I look Asian? You know, came to us at 7 months. I don't think the young men are set up for that kind of competition. Number two, this is a huge global problem. And Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, about 5 years ago, was asked what her number one problem in Germany was. She says, it's our man problem. We've got a real problem going forward. Number three, the jobs that are being replaced by technology are largely male jobs. So manufacturing. You know, the people remember, you know, only 30 years ago, you could leave high school at grade 10, get a job with United Auto Workers, go work next to your father on a plant, make yourself $60,000, $70,000 a year plus overtime, right? Have a good middle-class life, and all you're doing is fixing rivets. Now a machine does it. So the dislocation of work has been largely on the male side. The expansion of work has been largely on the healthcare and social service side, which is where women are sort of trained to go. So the number one thing I would suggest you do is in your whole year conversations about planning for work and careers, that you look at it really carefully to see what kind of gender messages you're sending. And you're not going to fix it by yourself because it's what's on TV. You know, the nurses are almost all women and the doctors are almost all men. I mean, you can't fix that and do something in your curriculum. But young men have to be exposed to a much broader range of things going forward. If I were to add something else, and somebody mentioned this in one of the talks here already, if you could focus in your school on design work, more classes on design or incorporating sort of the design thinking into your classwork, because design thinking applies to absolutely everything. It isn't about designing, you know, new clothes or designing artwork. Design thinking is about thinking how to make processes work better or products work better, more efficiently or whatever. And design thinking is really gender neutral. Because once you get people into those things, they develop a set of skills that they can apply in absolutely any field as they go along. Number four, look at the pressure that young men are under. You know, one of the biggest problems we have with young men is their male fathers. Their fathers have expected that what worked for them will work for their kids. I went and worked for for auto workers. I became or I worked in the oil rigs. You know, you can go and do that too. Well, now you have to have an engineering degree, or you have to have more specialized training, or they've laid a whole bunch of people off, right? And the fathers put a huge amount of pressure. So when it comes to the work things, I would actually spend almost as much time on the parents as I would on the kids, because the parents make a whole series of judgments about what's valuable and important, and they are working on the models of what worked in the 70s and 80s. And the one thing we know is the 70s and 80s are a long time ago now. You know, that it just isn't what will work and be successful in our day and age. So the number one issue, I've now gone a whole list of numbers here and there, identify it as a really serious problem, because it is a really, really serious problem. Veterinary medicine, by the way, across the country is 90% female. You know, they win all the competitions. It's grade-based in Canada, right? We don't have quotas on the number of men that get into veterinary medicine. So we have to start talking about it in exactly the way you did. It is a really, really big issue. And it strikes at the heart of what it means to be a man in society. And that's an issue we haven't even started to confront. But the numbers are getting really worrisome. Really worrisome. And the number of young men who they haven't gone to university, they haven't gone to college, they've just dropped out of the workforce, is getting larger in Canada. It's huge in the United States. Because most of the American work in the manufacturing sector is gone, and that was largely a male enterprise. So, does that help at all? That's I'm glad you asked the question. It's a really serious one. And nobody has a good answer yet.
If there are no other questions, I don't see any. I just want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Coates for his presentation this evening. Clearly, throughout the presentation, not only does he have a grasp of what some of our challenges are, but he does provide us with a number of solutions. And typically when I get solutions, I say, oh, this is great, a roadmap. But at the same time, he's really throwing down the gauntlet and challenged us as leaders within our schools, within our communities, to try to take whatever the next step would look like to make sure we're looking at that sustainability and that viability, to engage these challenges that we're facing in an effective way, because as the world changes, there's no question our youth do look to us for direction and leadership, and we need to be prepared to give it. I had other comments to make, but really the questions that he was asked kind of even refocuses the entire talk. So Ken, on behalf of the Alberta Rural Education Symposium, everyone in the room, we want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and to challenge us once again with your ideas, your visions, and certainly some of the solutions that you're putting forward. Thank you very much. And so now we are moving to the end of this part of the evening. I'm supposed to give some reminders. A reminder, first of all, that the registration will be open at 7 in the morning tomorrow. Breakfast starts promptly at 8 here within the room, and our program will start at 9 o'clock within the room. I have been asked to remind any of the presenters doing the Pechakucha, I hope I said it right, sessions tomorrow. They're asked to meet briefly at the back of the room here at 8:40, about 5 minutes after we're done, to meet with Donna to make sure we have everything kind of together. And a final reminder that our Mix and Mingle is going to be on the second floor. That's up the stairs in the Galleria. You'll see it once you get there. Thanks very much for your attention and your involvement this evening. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.